Hotel manager ignored Tommy Tuberville until he showed a card that changed everything. The autumn rain hammered against the glass windows of the Grand Continental Hotel in downtown Chicago, each droplet creating intricate patterns that reflected the city's neon lights, like liquid diamonds cascading down the pristine surface. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening in late October, and the lobby, usually bustling with business travelers and tourists from around the world, had settled into the quiet hum of late-night operations. The marble floors gleamed under the crystal chandeliers that hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen fireworks, and the scent of expensive cologne mingled with fresh orchids and roses arranged in Waterford crystal vases filled the air with an atmosphere of understated luxury. Marcus Wellington adjusted his perfectly pressed navy Armani suit and straightened his gold-plated name tag that read General Manager in elegant Tiffany script. At 38 years old, he had worked his way up from a teenage bellhop at a modest Holiday Inn in suburban Detroit to running one of Chicago's most prestigious five-star hotels. His success had come from his unwavering attention to detail, his encyclopedic knowledge of luxury hospitality standards, and his seemingly supernatural ability to instantly assess guests based on their appearance, behavior, and spending potential. In the cutthroat world of high-end hospitality, first impressions weren't just important, they were absolutely everything that separated profitable establishments from those that struggled to maintain their reputation. The Grand Continental had earned its five-star rating through meticulous attention to every detail, from the thread count of Egyptian cotton sheets to the specific temperature at which champagne was served in the rooftop restaurant. Marcus had built his career on understanding that their clientele consisted of Fortune 500 CEOs, Hollywood celebrities, foreign dignitaries, and wealthy tourists who thought nothing of spending $3,000 a night for a penthouse suite with panoramic views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline. The automatic glass doors, polished to mirror perfection, slid open with a barely audible whisper, and Marcus barely glanced up from the computerized reservation system he was meticulously reviewing for tomorrow's arriving VIP guests. The sound of wet footsteps on the Carrara marble made him look toward the entrance with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to categorizing visitors within seconds of their arrival. What he saw made him furrow his brow in undisguised disapproval and growing irritation. A man in his late 60s shuffled through the doors like someone carrying the weight of decades on his shoulders, his weathered and deeply lined face showing the unmistakable signs of someone who had spent countless hours under the relentless southern sun. His steel-grey hair was disheveled from the wind and rain, with droplets of water dripping steadily from the brim of an old, faded Auburn University baseball cap that had clearly seen better days, perhaps even better decades. The man wore a simple red and blue flannel shirt that looked like it had been purchased from a Walmart clearance rack, paired with well-worn Levi's jeans that had faded to the color of old denim, and scuffed brown work boots that left small puddles of rainwater with each deliberate step he took across the pristine floor. Tommy Tuberville paused just inside the magnificent entrance, his tired eyes taking in the opulent surroundings that seemed to belong to a different world entirely from the one he was accustomed to navigating. The warmth of the lobby was a welcome relief from the bitter cold of the Chicago night that had cut through his clothes like a knife. But he felt immediately and profoundly out of place among all the luxury and grandeur that surrounded him. The crystal chandeliers above cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock his simple appearance, and the elegant furnishings whispered of wealth and privilege that felt as foreign to him as a distant planet. He had never been one for fancy establishments, preferring instead the honest simplicity of small-town diners where you could get a decent cup of coffee and a hamburger without having to worry about which fork to use, or modest roadside motels during his countless travels across the country for recruiting visits and speaking engagements. But tonight was fundamentally different from all those other nights. Tonight, he needed to be here at this specific hotel for reasons that went beyond personal comfort or preference. Marcus watched the elderly stranger with growing irritation that he struggled to conceal behind his professional facade. The Grand Continental Hotel catered exclusively to an elite clientele who expected and demanded a certain level of sophistication and exclusivity. Fortune 500 executives conducting multi-million-dollar deals, A-list celebrities seeking privacy and luxury, wealthy international tourists, and influential political figures who required the utmost discretion and impeccable service. These were the guests who kept the hotel profitable and maintained its reputation as one of the finest establishments in the Midwest. This disheveled stranger looked like he had wandered in from the streets, probably seeking nothing more than shelter from the increasingly violent storm that was battering the city. His appearance suggested someone who couldn't afford a meal at McDonald's, let alone accommodation at a hotel where the cheapest room cost more than many people earned in a week. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus called out, his voice carrying that particular tone of polite but unmistakably firm authority that he had perfected over years of dealing with unwelcome visitors. He approached Tommy with measured, deliberate steps, maintaining the professional facade that he had learned to use as both a shield and a weapon when the situation demanded it. "I'm afraid this is a private hotel establishment. If you're looking for shelter from the rain, there's a public library about 6 blocks north on State Street that stays open until midnight, and there are several shelters on the south side that provide overnight accommodation." Tommy looked up at the impeccably dressed manager, immediately noting the man's dismissive expression and the way his sharp eyes had quickly assessed, categorized, and dismissed him in the span of just a few seconds. He recognized that look. He had encountered this particular type of judgment countless times throughout his life, from his humble beginnings in rural Alabama to his years coaching at various universities across the South. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here and everyone knows it." The familiar sting of being prejudged never got easier to bear, no matter how many times he experienced it. But Tommy had learned long ago that responding with anger or indignation rarely changed minds or hearts. Instead, he had developed a quiet dignity that served him well in situations where others might have lost their composure. "Actually, I'm looking for a room," Tommy said quietly, his thick Alabama accent carrying the weight of exhaustion from a long day of travel and the accumulated fatigue of too many similar encounters over the years. "I need to stay here tonight." Marcus couldn't hide his skepticism, and he didn't really try to. He glanced once more at Tommy's appearance, taking in every detail from the worn baseball cap to the scuffed work boots, and felt his assumptions crystallize into certainty. The cheapest room at the Grand Continental cost $450 per night during their off-season, and their premium suites commanded well over $1,500. Their penthouse accommodations, which came with personal concierge service and panoramic city views, could cost as much as $3,000 for a single night. This man, with his Walmart clothes and working-class appearance, looked like someone who would need to save for months just to afford a night at a budget motel along the interstate. The very suggestion that he could pay for accommodation at a 5-star establishment seemed almost insulting to Marcus's professional sensibilities. "Sir, I appreciate your interest, but our rates start at $450 per night, and that's for our most basic accommodations without any amenities," Marcus explained, his tone suggesting quite clearly that the conversation should end there, and that any reasonable person would understand the implicit message. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the budget motels along Interstate 90 or near O'Hare Airport. They're much more reasonably priced and would better suit your circumstances." The night desk clerk A young woman named Sarah Chen watched the unfolding interaction with growing discomfort that she tried to hide behind her professional smile. She had been working at the Grand Continental for 2 years, ever since graduating from Northwestern University's hospitality program, and during that time she had witnessed Marcus's treatment of guests who didn't meet his exacting standards of appearance or perceived wealth. While she understood the business necessity of catering to high-paying clientele, after all, their salaries depended on maintaining the hotel's profitable operations, something about this elderly man's quiet dignity and respectful demeanor made her feel increasingly certain that Marcus was making a significant mistake. There was something in the stranger's eyes, a depth and intelligence that suggested experiences far beyond what his simple appearance might indicate. Sarah had learned to trust her instincts about people during her years in hospitality, and those instincts were telling her that there was much more to this gentleman than met the eye. Tommy reached into his back pocket, feeling for the worn leather wallet that had been his faithful companion for over 20 years. The leather had been worn smooth by countless years of use, shaped by the natural oils from his hands and the countless times it had been pulled from his pocket during travels across the country. That wallet contained far more than Marcus Wellington could have possibly imagined. Not just money, but identification that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of this conversation if he chose to reveal it. But before Tommy could retrieve his wallet and show its contents, Marcus continued his dismissive monologue, apparently determined to end this uncomfortable encounter as quickly and efficiently as possible. "Look, I don't mean to be rude or insensitive, but we have a certain clientele here," Marcus said, lowering his voice slightly as if sharing a confidential business insight. "Our guests expect a particular atmosphere and level of service that maintains the exclusivity they're paying for. I'm sure you understand that maintaining that environment is absolutely crucial to our reputation and our ability to continue operating at this level of excellence." The implication was crystal clear, delivered with the kind of polite brutality that the hospitality industry had perfected over decades of practice. Tommy felt the familiar sting of being judged solely on his external appearance, reduced to nothing more than a potential threat to someone else's comfort or expectations. He thought about the countless hotel rooms he had stayed in over his many years of travel, from luxury resorts during major college football bowl games to modest accommodations during grueling recruiting trips across the rural South. He remembered the days when his name alone would have opened doors, when hotel managers would have competed for the privilege of hosting him and his coaching staff. He recalled the respect and instant recognition he had once commanded, the way people's faces would light up with excitement when they realized who he was. But those days of automatic recognition seemed like they belonged to a different lifetime, a different world, where his achievements and contributions were immediately visible rather than hidden beneath the surface of ordinary appearance. "I understand perfectly," Tommy replied, his voice remaining steady despite the hurt and disappointment he felt growing in his chest. "But I still need a room for tonight, and I assure you that I can pay for it." Marcus sighed internally, realizing with growing frustration that this stubborn old man wasn't going to take the increasingly obvious hint and leave quietly. The last thing he needed was a scene in the lobby that might disturb other guests or create the kind of negative atmosphere that could damage the hotel's reputation. He would have to be more direct in his refusal, though he would continue to maintain his professional demeanor to avoid any potential complaints or negative reviews that might appear online and damage the hotel's carefully cultivated image. "Sir, even if financial considerations weren't an issue, I'm afraid we're completely booked tonight," Marcus lied, with the smooth confidence that came from years of practice in the art of polite deception. He knew perfectly well that they had at least 23 available rooms, including several suites and their premium penthouse accommodation. The autumn convention season has us at full capacity, and we've been sold out for weeks. However, I'd be happy to call around to some other establishments in the area that might have availability at more appropriate price points." Sarah shifted uncomfortably behind the mahogany reception desk, glancing nervously at her computer screen that clearly displayed their current availability in unmistakable detail. The lie was so transparent that she felt embarrassed on behalf of her boss, and she caught Tommy's eye for just a moment. What she saw there wasn't anger or indignation at being obviously deceived, but rather a deep weariness that seemed to speak of years of fighting similar battles, both on various fields of competition and in the broader arena of life itself. There was something about his quiet dignity in the face of this treatment that reminded her of her own grandfather, a Korean War veteran who had faced discrimination and prejudice throughout his life, but had never allowed it to diminish his inherent sense of self-worth or his commitment to treating others with respect and kindness. Tommy nodded slowly, understanding with perfect clarity that he was being deliberately and systematically turned away based on nothing more than his appearance and the assumptions that Marcus had made within seconds of seeing him. He had faced much tougher opponents than a snobbish hotel manager during his decades of coaching competitive college football, dealing with hostile crowds, biased referees, and opposing coaches who would use any advantage to gain the upper hand. This situation required the same kind of strategic thinking and patience that had served him well in those high-pressure environments. He wasn't ready to give up just yet. There was a specific and compelling reason why he needed to stay at this particular hotel tonight, and he wasn't going to let prejudice and narrow-minded assumptions derail his carefully made plans. The rain continued to pound against the floor-to-ceiling windows with increasing intensity, and the lobby's carefully controlled warmth made Tommy's wet flannel shirt feel uncomfortable against his skin. He looked around at the elegant furnishings that surrounded him, the fresh floral arrangements that probably cost more than many people's monthly grocery budgets, the oil paintings of famous Chicago landmarks that adorned the walls, and the crystal sculptures that caught and reflected the light from the chandeliers above. This was exactly the type of establishment where appearances mattered more than character, where snap judgments were made in seconds based on superficial observations, and where a person's worth was measured entirely by their ability to display external markers of wealth and success. It was a world that valued the wrong things and missed the most important qualities that truly defined a person's value and contribution to society. "Before you make those calls to other hotels," Tommy said with quiet determination, his voice carrying a subtle authority that hadn't been there moments before, "maybe you should know exactly who you're talking to." Marcus rolled his eyes slightly, a gesture he tried to make subtle, but which was clearly visible to both Tommy and Sarah. He was expecting the old man to make some desperate claim about local political connections, or perhaps to boast about a relative who was supposedly important in Chicago business or political circles. He had heard it all before, the desperate attempts of people trying to gain entry to places where they clearly didn't belong, the fabricated stories designed to create leverage where none existed. But as Tommy's weathered fingers closed around the small leather folder in his back pocket, he found himself pausing to consider the broader implications of what he was about to do. He thought about all the years he had spent proving himself through actions rather than credentials, earning respect through dedicated service and integrity rather than by waving titles or positions in people's faces. Did he really want to resort to using his official position to force his way into a place that had already judged him unworthy based on his appearance? The seconds stretched out like an eternity as Tommy weighed his options with the same careful deliberation he had once used to plan game strategies and make crucial coaching decisions. He could simply walk away from this uncomfortable situation, find another hotel, and avoid the confrontation entirely. He had done exactly that countless times before throughout his life, choosing the path of least resistance when faced with prejudice and narrow-mindedness rather than forcing confrontations that might create more problems than they solved. But something about this particular situation felt fundamentally different from all those previous encounters. Maybe it was the accumulated exhaustion from his long journey to Chicago, or perhaps it was the weight of too many similar experiences over the years finally reaching a breaking point. Or maybe it was simply the recognition that remaining silent in the face of injustice made him complicit in perpetuating a system that judged people by all the wrong criteria. Marcus tapped his manicured fingers impatiently on the polished marble countertop, the sound creating a rhythm that seemed to echo through the otherwise quiet lobby. His patience was wearing thin, and he wanted this uncomfortable encounter to end as quickly as possible so he could return to his important administrative duties and maintain the hotel's pristine reputation. "Well," Marcus prompted, his tone making it abundantly clear that his tolerance for this situation had reached its absolute limit. Tommy pulled out his wallet with deliberate care and slowly extracted a small card from one of its compartments. It wasn't flashy or elaborate, just a simple piece of plastic that contained more history, significance, and authority than Marcus could possibly comprehend at first glance. As Tommy held it in his work-worn hands, memories flooded back of everything that card represented: decades of dedicated public service, countless victories and defeats in the political arena, and the trust and respect of millions of constituents across the state of Alabama. The lobby's antique grandfather clock began its midnight chime, the deep, resonant notes seeming to mark a pivotal moment in what had started as a simple request for accommodation. Tommy made his decision with the same decisive clarity that had characterized his most important choices throughout his life, from his transition from playing football to coaching it, to his later move from the world of college athletics to the complex arena of national politics. He would show Marcus the card, not out of arrogance or a desire for special treatment, but because sometimes people needed to be confronted with the reality of their own prejudices and assumptions. Sometimes the only way to create meaningful change was to force individuals to face the consequences of their snap judgments and biased behavior. Tommy held the identification card between his thumb and forefinger, studying Marcus's expectant expression with the same careful attention to detail that he had once used to analyze opposing teams' strategies and weaknesses. The general manager's face showed barely concealed irritation, mixed with the kind of patronizing patience that suggested he was mentally preparing to escort this delusional vagrant to the door as quickly and quietly as possible. Behind the reception desk, Sarah continued to watch the scene unfold with a growing sense that something significant was about to happen. Her instincts, honed by 2 years of observing human behavior in the hospitality industry, were telling her that this elderly gentleman possessed a quiet authority that went far deeper than his humble appearance might suggest. There was something in his posture, something in the way he carried himself, despite the dismissive treatment he was receiving, that spoke of a lifetime of leadership and responsibility. "This might help clarify the situation," Tommy said quietly, extending the card toward Marcus with the same measured dignity he had maintained throughout this increasingly uncomfortable encounter. Marcus took the small plastic card with the resigned attitude of someone who was humoring what he assumed to be a delusional person. He fully expected to see a fake business card claiming the old man was a CEO of some imaginary company, or perhaps a membership card to a local Elks Lodge or VFW post that the man somehow thought would impress a manager of a 5-star hotel. He had encountered every conceivable type of fabricated credential over his years in luxury hospitality, desperate people trying to gain entry to exclusive establishments by creating fictional connections or wildly exaggerating their importance in various social or business circles. But as Marcus's eyes focused on the official identification card, His facial expression began to undergo a dramatic transformation that seemed to happen in slow motion. His eyebrows furrowed in concentration as his brain processed the information printed on the card, then slowly rose in growing recognition and dawning horror. The color drained from his face as he read and reread the name and title printed in official government typeface: Thomas Hawley Tuberville, United States Senator, Alabama. The card was unmistakably legitimate, bearing the official seal of the U.S. Senate, along with sophisticated security features that could not be forged or duplicated by amateur counterfeiters. Marcus's hands began to tremble almost imperceptibly as the full implications of his behavior over the past 20 minutes crashed down upon him like an avalanche of professional and personal disaster. He had just attempted to turn away a sitting United States senator, treating him with the kind of dismissive disrespect typically reserved for vagrants or troublemakers. He had made assumptions based entirely on appearance, profiled a public servant based on his clothing and accent, and essentially accused him of being unable to afford accommodation at the hotel. The potential consequences for both his career and the hotel's reputation were staggering and potentially catastrophic. "Senator Tuberville," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the soft hum of the lobby's climate control system and the distant sound of rain still pattering against the windows. He looked up at Tommy with wide eyes that reflected a mixture of shock, horror, and growing panic. I had absolutely no idea. I sincerely apologize." Tommy took back his identification and returned it to his wallet with the same deliberate care he had used to extract it, his movements unhurried and allowing Marcus ample time to fully process the magnitude of the situation. The senator's weathered face remained calm and composed, but there was something in his tired eyes, not anger exactly, but rather a profound sadness that seemed to speak of too many similar encounters over the years, too many situations where he had been judged and found wanting based on superficial observations rather than actual character or achievements. "Few people recognize me when they first meet me," Tommy replied, his Alabama accent now carrying an unmistakable weight of authority that had been present all along, but which Marcus had been too blinded by prejudice to notice. "I've learned over the years that most people tend to see exactly what they want to see, making snap judgments and assumptions based on appearances, rather than taking the time to actually get to know someone as an individual human being." Sarah approached the reception desk slowly, her earlier suspicions now completely confirmed. She had sensed there was something fundamentally different about this elderly gentleman from the moment he had walked through the hotel's doors, something that suggested depth, experience, and a lifetime of significant accomplishments that went far beyond what his humble appearance might indicate to casual observers. Now, watching Marcus struggle to regain his professional composure while grappling with the enormity of his mistake, she felt a complex mixture of vindication and profound second-hand embarrassment for her boss. Marcus's mind raced frantically as he tried to calculate the potential damage to both his personal career and the hotel's carefully cultivated reputation. The scenario playing out in his head was nothing short of a public relations nightmare of epic proportions. Prestigious Chicago hotel discriminates against United States senator. The story could easily make national news, trending on social media platforms, and potentially leading to investigations, boycotts, and the kind of negative publicity that could permanently damage the Grand Continental's standing in the luxury hospitality industry. His thoughts spiraled through increasingly dire possibilities: congressional hearings about discrimination in public accommodations, federal investigations into the hotel's practices, celebrity guests canceling their reservations, corporate clients moving their events to competitor establishments. The implications were not just staggering, they were potentially career-ending and could affect the livelihoods of every employee at the hotel. "Senator, please accept my most sincere and heartfelt apologies," Marcus began, his voice shaking with nervous energy and barely controlled panic. "There's been a terrible, inexcusable misunderstanding on my part. Of course, we have rooms available. In fact, I would like to personally offer you our presidential suite at absolutely no charge as compensation for this unfortunate and completely unacceptable incident." Tommy studied the manager's face with the same careful attention he had once used to evaluate the character and motivations of young athletes under his coaching supervision. He noted how quickly and dramatically the man's demeanor had shifted from dismissive condescension to almost desperate obsequiousness. It was a transformation he had witnessed many times before throughout his life, and it never failed to disappoint him on a fundamental level. The respect being offered now wasn't genuine recognition of his dignity as a human being. It was nothing more than damage control motivated by fear of consequences rather than any true understanding of the harmful nature of the prejudicial treatment he had received. This wasn't about Marcus suddenly recognizing Tommy's inherent worth. It was about a hotel manager trying to prevent a public relations disaster that could destroy his career. "I don't want anything for free, Mr. Wellington," Tommy said firmly, using the manager's name from his gold-plated name tag. "I never have wanted special treatment, and I'm not going to start now. I've worked hard for everything I've earned in my life, and I'll pay for my room just like any other guest who walks through those doors. What I would appreciate is being treated with the same basic courtesy and respect that you would show to any paying customer, regardless of how they happen to be dressed or where they come from." The hotel lobby fell into an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch on forever, broken only by the sound of rain continuing to tap against the floor-to-ceiling windows and the distant, almost inaudible hum of elevator machinery somewhere in the building's depths. Marcus stood frozen behind the reception desk, completely unsure how to respond to this unexpected lesson in human dignity and professional responsibility that was being delivered with quiet authority by the same man he had attempted to turn away just minutes earlier. He had spent his entire career in the luxury hospitality industry, focused on identifying and catering to wealthy guests who could afford premium services, but he had never seriously considered the human cost of his discriminatory practices or the damage that snap judgments based on appearance could inflict on innocent people. The realization that he had built his professional success on a foundation of systematic prejudice was both humbling and deeply disturbing. Sarah stepped forward, her voice gentle but clear, carrying the kind of natural warmth and genuine hospitality that couldn't be taught in any hotel management program. "Senator Tuberville, I would be truly honored to help you get settled in for the evening. We have several excellent rooms available, and I can personally ensure that you receive exactly the level of service that every guest deserves, regardless of their background or appearance." Tommy turned to the young woman and offered her a genuine smile, the first truly warm expression he had shown since entering the hotel. In her respectful demeanor and natural kindness, he recognized the kind of character that was becoming increasingly rare in a world that often prioritized superficial appearances over genuine human decency. "Thank you very much, Sarah," he said, reading her name tag with the same attention to personal details that had made him effective in building relationships with players, fellow coaches, and constituents throughout his career. "That's very kind of you, and I appreciate your professionalism. I'd like a standard room, nothing fancy or elaborate. I'm only planning to stay one night." As Sarah began processing the reservation with efficient professionalism, Marcus finally found his voice again, though it carried none of the confident authority that had characterized his earlier dismissive statements. "Senator, please understand that this kind of treatment isn't representative of how we normally operate. The Grand Continental has always prided itself on providing exceptional service to all our guests without exception. This was an aberration, a complete failure on my part that doesn't reflect our established values or standard operating procedures. Tommy looked at Marcus with tired eyes that had witnessed too much of the world's casual cruelty and everyday prejudices during his decades of public life. Those eyes had seen discrimination in all its forms, from the subtle slights experienced by young athletes from disadvantaged backgrounds to the more overt prejudice that still existed in various corners of American society. "Was it really an aberration, Mr. Wellington?" Tommy asked quietly, his question carrying the weight of someone who had experienced similar treatment countless times before. "Or is this exactly how you normally treat people who don't look like they belong in your carefully constructed world of luxury and exclusivity?" The question hung in the air like a moral indictment, and Marcus found himself completely unable to formulate an adequate response. Deep in his heart, beneath all the professional justifications and business rationalizations, he knew that Tommy was absolutely correct. This wasn't the first time he had made snap judgments about potential guests based solely on their appearance, clothing, or perceived social status. It wasn't the first time he had turned away someone who didn't meet his preconceived notions of what a five-star hotel customer should look like. How many other people had he treated with similar dismissiveness over the years? How many individuals had been made to feel unwelcome, unworthy, or unwanted simply because they failed to project the external markers of wealth and social status that he had been trained to recognize and prioritize? "I've been involved in politics for several years now," Tommy continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone accustomed to addressing diverse audiences and explaining complex concepts to people from all walks of life. "But before that, I spent the majority of my adult life in coaching, specifically college football coaching. And one of the most important and fundamental lessons I learned during all those years working with young athletes was that you absolutely cannot judge a player's heart, determination, character, or ultimate potential by looking at their uniform, their equipment, or their background circumstances." He paused, allowing his words to sink in while Sarah continued working efficiently at her computer terminal to complete his reservation. "Some of my most successful players, young men who went on to achieve great things both on the football field and in their subsequent careers, came from backgrounds where they couldn't afford the fancy equipment and designer training gear that other recruits might have had. Their families couldn't provide them with private coaching, expensive summer camps, or the latest athletic technology. But they possessed something far more valuable and ultimately more predictive of success than any external marker of privilege or advantage." Tommy's voice carried the warmth and conviction of someone sharing a fundamental truth learned through decades of experience working with people from all backgrounds and circumstances. They had character, they had integrity, they had an unshakable determination to succeed despite obstacles and challenges that would have defeated less resilient individuals. They had the kind of inner strength and moral foundation that can't be purchased with money or inherited through social connections. Sarah finished entering all the reservation details into the hotel's computer system and handed Tommy his keycard with a warm, genuine smile. "You're in room 847, Senator Tuberville," she said professionally, but with obvious sincerity. "It's one of our quieter rooms on the 8th floor, with a lovely view of the city skyline and Lake Michigan. Is there anything else you might need tonight to ensure your comfort?" "Just directions to the elevator and perhaps information about your breakfast hours," Tommy replied graciously. "And Sarah, thank you for treating me like a human being from the very moment I walked through those doors. That kind of genuine courtesy and respect means more than you could possibly know, especially after the evening I've had." As Tommy prepared to make his way to the elevator bank, Marcus made one final desperate attempt at damage control, though his voice now carried a note of genuine concern rather than just professional panic. Senator, perhaps we could discuss this situation further tomorrow morning. I would very much like to find a way to make this right, to ensure that you leave here with a positive impression of our establishment and our commitment to treating all guests with appropriate respect. Tommy paused in his walk toward the elevators and turned back to face the general manager. In that moment, Marcus saw not the disheveled vagrant he had initially perceived and dismissed, but a distinguished public servant who carried the enormous weight of representing millions of constituents, who had spent decades earning the respect and trust of others through consistent actions, rather than superficial appearances or inherited advantages. The senator's presence seemed to fill the lobby in a way that had nothing to do with physical stature, and everything to do with the quiet authority that came from a lifetime of genuine service to others. "Mr. Wellington," Tommy said slowly, choosing his words with the careful precision of someone accustomed to having his statements analyzed and quoted by media outlets across the country. "The only way you can truly make this situation right is by learning from it and ensuring that it never happens again, not just to me, but to anyone who walks through those doors." He gestured toward the hotel's elegant entrance, where the automatic doors continued to whisper open and closed as the occasional late-night arrival made their way into the lobby. "The next time someone enters this establishment who doesn't look like they belong in your world according to your preconceived notions, someone whose appearance doesn't immediately signal wealth, status, or social acceptability, I want you to remember this conversation. Take a moment to actually speak with them as fellow human beings before you decide they're not worthy of your hospitality. You might be genuinely surprised by what you discover about their character, their accomplishments, and their inherent dignity as individuals." With that powerful statement hanging in the air like a moral challenge, Tommy walked toward the elevator bank with measured steps, his worn work boots making soft sounds against the polished marble floor. As he waited for the elevator to arrive, he reflected on the evening's events and the broader significance of what had transpired. Tomorrow would bring a full schedule of important meetings and responsibilities that would require all of his experience, wisdom, and diplomatic skills. He had breakfast meetings scheduled with Chicago area business leaders to discuss economic development initiatives, followed by a tour of a veterans rehabilitation facility on the city's south side, and then an evening fundraising event for a local children's charity that served underprivileged communities. But tonight's encounter had reminded him of something equally important and fundamental, that human dignity and inherent worth weren't determined by external appearances, social status, or financial resources. The lesson was one that applied far beyond the hospitality industry, extending into every aspect of how people interacted with and treated one another in daily life. The elevator doors opened with their characteristic soft chime, and Tommy stepped inside, leaving behind a hotel lobby that seemed somehow fundamentally different than it had been just 45 minutes earlier. The same elegant furnishings were in place. The same crystal chandeliers cast their warm light across the marble floors, and the same fresh flowers filled the air with their expensive fragrance. But the atmosphere itself had been altered by the moral reckoning that had taken place. Marcus stood motionless behind the reception desk, staring at the closing elevator doors, while grappling with the profound realization that his entire approach to hospitality, and perhaps to life itself, required fundamental reconsideration and dramatic change. The comfortable assumptions that had guided his career success were now revealed as systematic prejudices that had caused real harm to real people, and the weight of that recognition was both humbling and transformative. The 8th floor of the Grand Continental Hotel was enveloped in the kind of hushed tranquility that only the most exclusive luxury establishments could provide through careful attention to soundproofing, climate control, and every detail of the guest experience. Thick, plush carpeting in muted gold and burgundy tones muffled every footstep, and the walls were adorned with museum-quality artwork depicting Chicago's most famous architectural marvels, from the iconic Willis Tower to the elegant curves of Marina City, each piece carefully selected and professionally lit to create an atmosphere of sophisticated urban culture. Tommy made his way down the hallway with deliberate steps, the keycard feeling surprisingly familiar in his weathered hands despite the completely unfamiliar and luxurious surroundings. After decades of travel for coaching duties, recruiting trips, and now senatorial responsibilities, he had stayed in hundreds of hotels across the country, but he typically chose more modest accommodations that reflected both his personal preferences and his philosophy about fiscal responsibility with taxpayer money. Room 847 was modest by the Grand Continental's admittedly high standards, but it was still more elaborate and luxurious than anything Tommy typically chose for himself during his travels. The space featured a king-sized bed dressed in Egyptian cotton linens, with a thread count that probably exceeded the annual income of many of his constituents, a comfortable sitting area with handcrafted leather chairs positioned strategically near floor-to-ceiling windows, and a marble bathroom that gleamed under carefully designed lighting that would have made Hollywood makeup artists envious. But what immediately captured Tommy's attention and drew him across the room was the spectacular view that stretched out beyond the rain-streaked windows. Through the expansive windows, Chicago stretched out in all directions like a living map of American urban achievement, its countless lights twinkling like earthbound constellations against the darkness of the October night. The storm that had been battering the city was finally beginning to subside, and occasional breaks in the heavy cloud cover revealed tantalizing glimpses of a full moon whose silver light reflected off the dark surface of Lake Michigan in the distance, creating a pathway of shimmering light that seemed to stretch toward infinity. Tommy set his small overnight bag, a practical piece of luggage that had accompanied him on countless trips over the years, on the mahogany desk, and stood at the window, his reflection appearing ghost-like against the magnificent cityscape. The contrast between his simple appearance and the luxury surrounding him seemed to symbolize the broader themes that had emerged during his encounter with Marcus Wellington in the lobby below. He found himself thinking about Sarah Chen, the young woman behind the reception desk who had treated him with genuine kindness and respect from the very first moment their eyes had met. In her natural warmth and professional courtesy, he had recognized something that was becoming increasingly rare in modern society: the ability to see past surface appearances and superficial markers of social status to recognize the fundamental human dignity that existed within every individual, regardless of their circumstances or background. Sarah had demonstrated what true hospitality meant, not the calculated deference shown to those perceived as wealthy or important, but the kind of genuine courtesy and respect that should be extended to every person as a basic recognition of their inherent worth as fellow human beings. She had sensed his dignity and character before she knew his title or position, and that spoke to a quality of character that couldn't be taught in any hospitality management program or corporate training seminar. Marcus Wellington, on the other hand, represented a different but equally common type of person that Tommy had encountered throughout his various careers in coaching and politics. Marcus wasn't malicious or deliberately cruel in his intentions, but he had constructed his entire worldview around a system of assumptions, categories, and snap judgments that made it easier for him to navigate complex social situations without having to invest the time and emotional energy required to truly engage with people as unique individuals. It was a survival mechanism that had probably served him well in a demanding business environment that relied heavily on quick assessments, efficient service delivery, and the ability to identify and cater to high-value customers. But this approach came at a significant cost in terms of human connection, moral integrity, and the broader social responsibility that came with positions of authority and influence. Tommy's smartphone buzzed softly with an incoming text message from his chief of staff back in Washington, confirming the details of tomorrow's packed schedule of meetings and events. He had a breakfast meeting at 7:30 a.m. with several prominent Chicago area business leaders to discuss federal initiatives aimed at supporting economic development in the Midwest, followed by a 10 a.m. tour of a veterans rehabilitation facility on the city's historically underserved South Side, and then an evening fundraising dinner for a local children's charity that provided educational support and after-school programs for kids from low-income families. It was a typical day in the life of a United States senator, a carefully orchestrated sequence of meetings, events, and public appearances that represented real people with genuine needs, legitimate concerns, and hopes for a better future. Each interaction would require his full attention, authentic engagement, and the kind of diplomatic skill that came from years of learning how to build bridges between people from vastly different backgrounds and perspectives. As he began to prepare for bed, carefully hanging his suit in the room's spacious closet and laying out tomorrow's clothes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been traveling extensively for decades, Tommy found himself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment in his life and career. His path to the United States Senate had been anything but conventional or predictable. Most of his adult life had been spent on football fields across the American South, first as a determined but ultimately not particularly gifted player at Southern Arkansas University, then as a coach at various colleges and universities where he had gradually built a reputation for integrity, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to developing young men not just as superior athletes, but as responsible citizens and productive members of society. The transition from the world of college athletics to the complex arena of national politics had not been easy or straightforward. In football, success was measured by clear, objective metrics: wins and losses, championships earned, bowl games won or lost. The scoreboard never lied, and at the end of each game, there was always a definitive answer to the question of who had performed better on that particular day. In politics, however, the metrics of success were far more complex, subjective, and often contradictory. Different constituents had different priorities. Competing interests sometimes made compromise impossible, and the media's interpretation of events didn't always align with the realities of legislative processes or the long-term consequences of policy decisions. But Tommy had discovered, somewhat to his surprise, that many of the same fundamental principles that had made him successful as a football coach served him equally well in his new role as a public servant. Honesty and straight talk, even when it wasn't what people wanted to hear. Hard work and meticulous preparation for every challenge and opportunity. Genuine care and concern for the people he was responsible for leading and representing. Most importantly, he had learned that the ability to see potential and worth in people, regardless of their background or current circumstances, was just as valuable in politics as it had been in coaching. Some of his most successful players had been young men who had been overlooked or underestimated by other coaches because they didn't fit conventional molds or meet traditional expectations. Similarly, some of his most valuable insights as a senator had come from constituents who might not have looked like policy experts, but who possessed real-world experience and practical wisdom that couldn't be found in any academic study or think tank report. Meanwhile, 8 floors below in the hotel's administrative offices, Marcus Wellington sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at his computer screen without actually seeing the reservation reports, occupancy statistics, and financial summaries that were displayed there in neat columns and colorful charts. The encounter with Senator Tuberville had shaken him more profoundly than he cared to admit to himself, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own character and the institutional culture he had created and fostered at the Grand Continental. He had always prided himself on his professionalism, his attention to detail, and his ability to maintain the hotel's reputation for excellence in an increasingly competitive luxury hospitality market. The Grand Continental's five-star rating wasn't just a marketing tool. It represented a genuine commitment to providing exceptional service, maintaining impeccable facilities, and creating experiences that justified the premium prices they charged. But tonight's events had revealed a significant blind spot in his character and management approach that he hadn't even realized existed until it was exposed in the most uncomfortable way possible. His systematic practice of making snap judgments about people based on their appearance, clothing, and perceived social status wasn't just morally problematic. It was also potentially devastating to the business he had worked so hard to build and maintain. A soft knock on his office door interrupted his troubled thoughts, and Sarah entered after receiving his permission. She looked tired after the long evening shift, but her expression showed more concern than fatigue as she approached his desk. "Mr. Wellington, I wanted to check on you before I headed home," she said with characteristic thoughtfulness. "You seemed pretty shaken up after Senator Tuberville went upstairs, and I wanted to make sure everything was okay." Marcus looked up at his young employee with fresh eyes, seeing her perhaps more clearly and completely than he had at any point during the 2 years she had worked at the hotel. Sarah came from a middle-class family in Chicago's diverse Northwest Side, where her parents had immigrated from South Korea in the 1980s and built a successful small business through decades of hard work, sacrifice, and determination. She was putting herself through Northwestern University's highly regarded hospitality management program by working night shifts at the Grand Continental. And throughout her employment, she had consistently demonstrated remarkable maturity, insight, and genuine empathy in her interactions with both guests and fellow staff members. Her performance reviews had always been exemplary, but Marcus realized he had never really taken the time to understand what made her so naturally effective at reading people and situations. "Sarah, can I ask you something important?" Marcus said, gesturing toward the comfortable chair across from his desk. "When Senator Tuberville first walked into our lobby tonight, did you have any idea who he was? Did you recognize him from television news coverage or political appearances?" Sarah shook her head thoughtfully as she settled into the chair. "No, I honestly had no idea who he was until he showed you his official identification. I don't follow politics very closely. Between work and school, I barely have time to keep up with local news, let alone national political figures. But—" She paused, choosing her words carefully as she had been trained to do in customer service situations. "But what?" Marcus prompted, genuinely curious about her perspective on the evening's events. "But I could tell immediately that there was something different about him," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who trusted her instincts about people. The way he carried himself, despite being tired and wet from the rain. The way he spoke, there was a quiet dignity in his voice, even when you were— She hesitated, not wanting to directly criticize her boss, but also committed to honesty. "Even when I was treating him badly," Marcus finished for her, his voice heavy with the weight of recognition and regret. "Yes," Sarah admitted quietly. "He had this presence that you don't encounter very often. Even when he was being turned away and essentially accused of not belonging here, he never lost his composure or became aggressive or demanding. He just seemed profoundly sad. Like this kind of treatment was something he had experienced many times before and had learned to expect from certain types of people and institutions." Marcus nodded slowly, processing her perceptive observations and beginning to understand how his own biases had blinded him to obvious signs of character and dignity that Sarah had immediately recognized. "Why didn't you say anything during the encounter? Why didn't you intervene when you could see what was happening?" Sarah looked uncomfortable, shifting slightly in her chair as she considered how to answer the question diplomatically but honestly. "Mr. Wellington, you're my boss, and I've learned from observing workplace dynamics that there are appropriate times and ways to offer input on management decisions. And to be completely frank, I've seen you make similar quick judgments about people before, based primarily on how they looked or dressed, rather than on their actual behavior or stated needs." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow to his conscience and professional self-image. "What do you mean? Can you give me specific examples?" "Well," Sarah began cautiously, "there was that businessman from Detroit last month who came in wearing casual clothes because his luggage had been lost by the airline. You initially treated him with suspicion until you discovered he was a Fortune 500 CEO. There was the elderly woman a few weeks ago who was dressed simply and spoke with a heavy accent. You seemed annoyed by her questions about room rates until you learned she was a retired university professor with a substantial travel budget." She paused, then continued with growing confidence. "I've watched you turn away several people over the past 2 years who probably could have afforded to stay here and who certainly deserve to be treated with basic courtesy, simply because they didn't immediately project the external markers of wealth and status that you've been trained to recognize and prioritize." Marcus felt his worldview crashing down around him as the full scope of his discriminatory behavior became impossible to deny or rationalize. He had created an environment where his own prejudices were so obvious and systematic that his employees had learned not to challenge them, accepting institutional bias as just another aspect of the job they needed to navigate carefully. "Sarah, I want you to know that this stops right now," Marcus said with a firmness that surprised both of them. "From this moment forward, we're going to treat every single person who walks through those doors with respect and courtesy, regardless of their appearance, their accent, their clothing, or any other superficial characteristic that has nothing to do with their inherent worth as human beings." He leaned forward, his voice carrying a conviction that reflected his growing understanding of the moral importance of this commitment. "And Sarah, I want you to promise me something that's going to become part of your official job responsibilities. If you ever see me or anyone else on our staff treating someone unfairly or making assumptions based on appearance, I want you to speak up immediately. That's not just a request. It's now a formal part of your position description and performance expectations." Sarah smiled genuinely for the first time that evening, feeling a sense of relief and renewed purpose in her work. "I can absolutely do that, Mr. Wellington. Thank you for being open to this kind of feedback and for committing to make these changes." After Sarah left to head home after her long shift, Marcus found himself alone with his thoughts and a growing sense of urgency to not just apologize for his behavior, but to implement meaningful, systemic changes that would prevent similar incidents in the future. He had spent years building his career on the premise that success in luxury hospitality meant catering exclusively to the wealthy and influential, while dismissing or discouraging those who didn't meet certain superficial standards of appearance and presumed spending power. But tonight's encounter with Senator Tuberville had revealed the fundamental moral flaw in that approach. More than that, it had shown him that his discriminatory practices weren't just ethically wrong, they were also potentially devastating to the business and reputation he had worked so hard to build. He thought about Tommy's words regarding his background in football coaching and the lesson about judging players by their character rather than their equipment or background circumstances. The analogy was more profound than Marcus had initially realized. In the hospitality industry, just as in athletics, success often came from recognizing potential and worth that might not be immediately obvious to casual observers. Marcus opened his laptop computer and began researching Senator Tuberville's background with the thoroughness that he typically reserved for analyzing competitor hotels and market trends. What he discovered over the next 2 hours painted a picture of a man whose entire life had been defined by service to others, whether as a coach developing young athletes into responsible adults, or as a senator representing the diverse needs and interests of millions of constituents. Tuberville's coaching career had spanned more than 2 decades, during which he had built an outstanding reputation for integrity, excellence, and genuine care for his players' academic and personal development. At Auburn University, he had led the football team to numerous victories while maintaining unusually high academic standards for his athletes and insisting on conduct that reflected positively on both the university and the broader community. His transition to politics had come later in life, motivated not by personal ambition or the desire for power, but by a sincere commitment to continuing his lifetime of service on a larger scale. The testimonials from former players, fellow coaches, and political colleagues that Marcus found online consistently painted a picture of someone whose private character matched his public reputation, a man of integrity, humility, and genuine concern for others. As Marcus read through article after article, interview after interview, and biographical sketch after biographical sketch, a clearer and more complete picture emerged of the man he had so rudely dismissed and attempted to turn away just hours earlier. This wasn't simply a senator who happened to dress casually. This was a public servant whose entire adult life had been dedicated to lifting others up, whether on football fields across the South or in the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. The realization of what he had nearly done, turning away a distinguished public servant who had dedicated his life to helping others based on nothing more than superficial assumptions about his appearance and social status, filled Marcus with a deep sense of shame that went far beyond professional embarrassment. This was a moral reckoning that forced him to confront the systematic prejudices that had guided his career and personal interactions for decades. But more than just shame, the evening's events had sparked a genuine determination to ensure that such an incident never happened again, not just at his hotel, but in any situation where he had the power to influence how people were treated. The comfortable assumptions and discriminatory practices that had seemed like natural business strategies were now revealed as systematic forms of prejudice that caused real harm to real people. As the night grew later and the hotel settled into the quiet rhythm that characterized the small hours between midnight and dawn, both Marcus and Tommy found themselves engaged in deep contemplation about the unexpected encounter that had brought them together. For Tommy, lying in the comfortable bed, while listening to the distant sounds of the city beyond his window, the evening's events served as another reminder of the important work that still needed to be done to create a society where people were consistently judged by their character and contributions rather than by superficial appearances or social markers. For Marcus, sitting in his office surrounded by the financial reports and operational documents that had once seemed like the most important measures of success, the encounter represented the beginning of a fundamental shift in how he viewed both his professional responsibilities and his broader obligations to his fellow human beings. The lesson that had emerged from their interaction was simultaneously simple and profound, that human dignity and worth weren't determined by external appearances, financial resources, or social status, but by the character, integrity, and inherent value that existed within every individual. It was a lesson that would require more than just policy changes or staff training to implement effectively. It would demand a complete transformation of institutional culture and personal values. Dawn broke over Chicago with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that transformed the city's imposing skyline into what appeared to be an architectural masterpiece etched against the brightening sky with mathematical precision. The violent storm that had battered the metropolitan area throughout the night had finally passed, leaving behind clean air that seemed to sparkle with possibility and the promise of a beautiful day filled with golden sunlight and comfortable temperatures that would make outdoor activities pleasant for both residents and visitors. Tommy Tuberville stood at his hotel room window, now fully dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit paired with a conservative burgundy tie that transformed his appearance so completely that he bore little resemblance to the man who had been dismissed as a vagrant just 12 hours earlier. The same individual who had been treated with suspicion and condescension now looked every inch the distinguished United States Senator he had always been, demonstrating how dramatically superficial appearances could change, while fundamental character remained constant. He had slept only fitfully during the night, his mind churning continuously over the events that had unfolded in the hotel lobby and their broader implications for American society. The encounter with Marcus Wellington wasn't just an isolated incident of poor customer service or personal rudeness. It was a symptom of much larger and more systemic problems that affected millions of Americans every single day across the country. As someone who had spent decades working with young people from diverse backgrounds, first as a college football coach and now as an elected official responsible for representing constituents from all walks of life, Tommy understood with painful clarity the crucial importance of first impressions and the lasting psychological damage that prejudice and discrimination could inflict on individuals and entire communities. The incident with Marcus wasn't unique or particularly unusual. It was representative of a pattern of behavior that occurred countless times every day in businesses, institutions, and personal interactions across America. People making snap judgments based on appearance, accent, clothing, or perceived social status. Individuals being treated as less worthy of respect, courtesy, or consideration, simply because they didn't project the external markers that others had been conditioned to associate with importance, success, or social acceptability. Downstairs in the hotel's elegant main dining room, Marcus arrived nearly an hour earlier than his usual schedule, having spent what could generously be described as a largely sleepless night, wrestling with his conscience and grappling with the profound implications of what he had learned about himself and his approach to both business and human relationships. The comfortable assumptions and practices that had guided his professional success were now revealed as systematic forms of discrimination that had caused real harm to real people. He had made several important decisions during those long, dark hours of soul-searching and moral reckoning. First and most importantly, he would personally apologize to Senator Tuberville in the most sincere and comprehensive way possible, taking full responsibility for his behavior without making excuses or attempting to minimize the impact of his actions. Second, he would use this transformative experience to implement immediate and lasting changes in how the Grand Continental treated all guests, regardless of their appearance or perceived social status. The hotel's restaurant manager, Elena Rodriguez, greeted Marcus with obvious surprise when she saw him entering the dining room at such an unusually early hour. Elena was a seasoned hospitality professional with over 18 years of experience in luxury establishments across the Midwest, and she had worked at the Grand Continental for almost 4 years, during which time she had developed a reputation for both exceptional service and keen insight into guest relations and staff management. "You're here quite early this morning, Marcus," she observed with characteristic directness, immediately noting the tired lines around his eyes and the uncharacteristic uncertainty and introspection that seemed to have replaced his usual confident demeanor. "Is everything all right? You look like you didn't get much sleep last night." Elena, I need to ask you something important, and I want you to be completely honest with me, even if the answer might be difficult to hear, Marcus said, as he settled into a comfortable chair near the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows, where he could maintain a clear view of the lobby and watch for Senator Tuberville's eventual arrival. In your professional opinion, based on your years of experience here and your observations of our daily operations, do you think we discriminate against potential guests based on their appearance, their clothing, or our assumptions about their financial status? Elena paused with her coffee cup halfway to her lips, clearly recognizing the serious nature of the question and the importance of providing a thoughtful, honest response. She was someone who had built her career on maintaining positive relationships with colleagues, while also upholding high standards of professional integrity, and she understood that this moment called for complete candor rather than diplomatic evasion. Marcus, you know that I have tremendous respect for you and genuine appreciation for everything you've done for my career development and professional growth. She began carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood the potential consequences of this conversation. You've been supportive, fair, and generous in providing opportunities for advancement. But if you want complete honesty about this particular issue, she paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. Yes, I do think that sometimes we make snap judgments about people that aren't fair or appropriate. I've observed situations where guests receive different levels of service, attention, and courtesy based primarily on how they're dressed, what kind of car they arrive in, or our initial assumptions about their spending potential rather than on their actual behavior or stated needs. Elena's voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed these patterns repeatedly over her years in the industry. It's not necessarily intentional cruelty or malicious discrimination, she continued, but it's still a form of prejudice that affects how people are treated and how they feel about themselves when they're in our establishment. I've seen guests who were perfectly capable of affording our services being made to feel unwelcome simply because their appearance didn't immediately signal wealth or social status. Marcus nodded grimly, feeling a complex mixture of appreciation for her honesty and deep regret about the institutional culture he had apparently fostered without fully recognizing its problematic nature. Elena, I want you to know that this pattern ends today, immediately and permanently. I want you to help me implement comprehensive new training protocols for every single member of our staff, from the doormen and valet attendants to the housekeeping supervisors and restaurant servers. His voice carried a conviction that reflected both his shame about past practices and his determination to create meaningful change.